than the Rainbow Coalition, right? This idea of, this multiracial coalition that brought trade unionists and civil rights campaigners and women's rights campaigners and LGBTQ community folks that reached out to Arab Americans and said, you too can be a part of these coalitions. This was big deal stuff. And in 1988, no less a figure than Johnny Apple, the great New York Times writer, and others, many, many good writers at that time, said the dynamism of the 88 campaign was Jackson. He was the guy who really excited people. He didn't get the nomination. And my book is not about winners always. A lot of people I write about lost, but they didn't lose because their ideas were bad. They lost because structural challenges were in their way. And the interesting part was that in 88, Jackson gave what was arguably the best speech ever at a Democratic National Convention. I would argue his speech to that convention was miraculous. It was amazing. I invite people to go back and listen to it. And it was electric. And what did they do? They turned around and said, oh, well, hey, thanks a lot. And by the way, instead of you, the guy who came in second, very strong, young, dynamic figure with a lot of following, who really could expand the base of the party, being thought about as vice presidential candidate, we're going to choose Lloyd Benson, the senator closest to bankers, a guy who literally had spent his life fighting against and defeating progressives in Texas. We're going to make him the vice president because that's going to be how we win the South, right? This whole concept. Well, what did they do? They lost Texas and every southern state, right? But they also lost California and Vermont and all sorts of states that would quickly become very liberal places. And in the book, I asked the question, I ran the numbers. What if you put Jesse Jackson on the ticket in 88? You might not have won, but these narrow defeats they had in all sorts of states across the country, I think a very good chance they would have prevailed, and you would have had a different course for the Democratic Party. The tragedy of it is that I think there are people who at that period were involved in the Democratic Party who were more willing to lose than to give up control of one of the two political parties for purposes of their status quo vision, their maintenance of a conservative, frankly, an economically conservative, neoliberal, and often neoconservative vision. And
we have to get to where we are today in a second, because I think a lot of people are saying, right, exactly, as we come out of this new primary experience. But before we get there, we got to go back to 1948. Was it Henry Wallace ran as an independent?
He ran as a third-party candidate. He and his allies created what was called the New Party. It became to be known as the Progressive Party.
And in 2000, not the same level of stature, but Ralph Nader, very important American figure, very high stature person, very serious person, runs, as the Green Party. And both of these to me from, if you're looking at it from the left, obviously Ross Perot ran a very serious campaign. As
helps to be a billionaire.
It helps to be a billionaire, and it helps to not have a left-wing message, and you can get a lot of, novelty press coverage that way. But these are the two serious left-wing third-party candidacies, and I think, Ralph Nader got about 3% nationally. Wallace got you said 3 million votes or so.
2 million.
2 million, sorry.
Actually, no, lower than that. I take it back. Wallace's 48 campaign crashed and burned.
So what's the less? I don't want to just do a kind of, morality tale about people voting third party or whatever, but I'm actually concerned strategically about this. One, I don't make any secret. I believe in tactical voting and lesser of two evils and all of that. I've never been convinced otherwise, so people know that. But even more fundamentally, the work that has been done by Bernie to bring things like Medicare for All back on the agenda, I don't think are served by getting 500,000 votes nationally for some kind of third-party thing. So anyways, that's my bias. But what is the lesson about the structural barriers to third-party politics that we have from two, I'm sure there's going to be some great people running third-party, but they're not the former vice president of the United States, and they are not the most prominent consumer advocate, regulatory activist of the 70s and 80s. And they couldn't do it in any real way. So what's the lesson here? The
lesson is this. Let me preface it by saying I don't tell people what to do politically. Honestly, I think people have their journeys, and they may determine. I actually write about this in the book. They may determine at a certain point that they want to do a third-party fight. And the fact is that if you look back at some of the third-party fights of the 1840s, where people said there's no place in these major parties for an opponent of slavery, right. And so I'm going to do a third-party run, James Burney being an example. He didn't get a lot of votes, but boy, and when I look at it historically, I think I like him. I think I like the person that did that. And similarly, in 1924, when Robert M. La Follette broke with the Republican Party and ran with the support of independents and socialists on a third-party run, saying that both the Democratic and the Republican Party were too much in the sway of the Ku Klux Klan and too influenced by Wall Street and military-industrial complex. So I respect people who take the journey that where they choose to go in the moment they do. And history will sometimes reward them, sometimes punish. But what I will tell you is you get to the heart of the matter when you talk about structural barriers. And I write a lot about that in the book. In 1948, when Henry Wallace ran for president as an independent progressive, he did put together quite a coalition. It was he was backed by Albert Einstein and Frank Lloyd Wright and Paul Robeson and a young Harry Belafonte, and a whole host of women's rights activists who went on to become prominent figures in America. When you look at the people that backed him in 48, it was pretty amazing. But this was an intellectual left, largely. Some activists. Right. No question of that there were some very good activists on the ground around the country. He accepted the support of communists at a time when the Red Scare was rising. He was not a communist. In fact, he was a very successful businessman. But he believed that you could have a broad popular front coalition and, still govern effectively. He hated the idea of the Red Scare and called it out quite bluntly. So here's where he was. He was running this campaign. Early polls showed him doing quite well. He got on the ballots, not everywhere, but most places. And then you can just see it happen. In the fall of 1948, the media, and this is separate from structural barriers of hard to get on ballots, hard to get in debates, all these things that we also talk about. I mean, it was savage. They brought out every criticism you can imagine of Wallace. They called him a spiritualist, right? Or they said he followed gurus because he was interested in
communist who follows gurus. This is my guy.
Yeah. Well, they also they literally attacked him for being in good shape, physically good shape, because he played tennis and stuff like that. And
he's awesome. I love this guy.
He played with boomerangs, which at the time were like the frisbee of the moment, and they ridiculed him for this. He said he's a 60-year-old man who's in good shape. What the hell's wrong with him? And so when you put all the pieces together, they called him a dupe of the communists. They called him a dupe of everybody. It was just daily brutal attacks. Now, he had brought some of it on himself. I don't try to write and say Wallace was perfect, but the fact of the matter is, you cannot believe how they unloaded on him. There were literally, I have some of them in the book, there were literally newspaper editorials that said, hey, this is the responsible position of the, kind of newspaper editorialists. Don't throw eggs at Wallace. Don't attack him physically. Just vote against him. That's the responsible position.
Right.
And Truman fed into this and gamed it. And at the end of the day, it failed terribly. Beautiful components of it. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Wallace and Pete Seeger and Paul Robeson and others went to the American South in the midst of American apartheid, literally deep segregation and Jim Crow, and they campaigned at multiracial rallies. Wallace refused to sleep in hotels that weren't integrated. He refused to hold rallies in rooms that weren't integrated. His vice presidential candidate, Glenn Taylor, was arrested by Bull Connor in Alabama for walking in a door that was marked non-whites, because Glenn Taylor, the vice presidential candidate, a U.S. senator at the time, said he would not, participate in the Jim Crow policies. So, I mean, important things that they did in that fight. but yet it failed. And in the book, I read a lot about a side group that's almost lost to history, and this was called Democrats for Wallace. And there was a group of people who argued in 48 that he should have fought his fight in the Democratic Party, even though he might well have lost to Truman, that he could have built out a fighting force within the party that would be an ongoing base for the left, and that ultimately would get further. Now, responsible people argue both sides. Similarly with Nader in 2000, right? You have all the arguments. What I will say is this. My looking at these things comes to a conclusion that, again, where people want to go, they should go. You must follow your vision. And if somebody can talk you out of your visions or your passions in your journey, that's another thing altogether. But for those who want to fight in the Democratic Party, for those who choose to do so, what they have to understand is that it's an ongoing fight, and you will have setbacks, severe setbacks. You'll have glorious moments and great breakthroughs, but then you will have, deep setbacks, and you just keep fighting on. You build it out, you get better, you run one campaign, figure something out, and run the next. And you look at the times. Remember, how did we break through on civil rights? You say, the Democratic Party backed civil rights. Well, in fact, in 1964, Republicans were actually a lot of Republicans were very good on civil rights as well. But what was really happening was the movements were so big. 1970, 71. Say, some Republicans were really good environmentalists, a lot of Democrats, but the movements were really big. I would argue that we are now at a moment today with the coronavirus pandemic, with mass unemployment, with all the challenges we face, and with a planet that is in crisis, physical crisis, that we have a moment where a visionary politics has tremendous potential. There may be setbacks, but to give up on trying, to give up on fighting, be it inside or outside, I think it's just not acceptable. You don't get to do that. You don't get to give up. Now, again, people may choose their different routes, but if you are going to fight in the Democratic Party, people should understand they're in a fight. They should understand that the status quo, that political elites, political establishment has always existed, that it's very small, that it's related to money, related to power, and that it will always be there. It will fight as hard as it can. It will often prevail. It will have many allies. This power will have many allies in the media. And once you recognize that fight, that it really is a fight for the soul of the party, then you fight harder. You push harder, and you don't blink. And I'm not accusing anybody of blinking. I'm just saying, now going forward, it should be a clear-eyed, clear understanding that these fights are really about whether we are going to have a functional future, and frankly, whether we're going to have a planet.
So final question then, and thank you so much for your time, and please everybody read this book. It's just such a great book. I agree with everything you're saying, but I definitely think, what just happened to Bernie is a significant, major defeat, and it's seriously bad news for the United States. It's bad news, arguably globally. And I think in some ways now is about holding whatever line you can hold for as long as possible while there's work put into primarily reviving trade unionism and whatever else. And that's kind of my view. So, I'm like you vote for the Democrat over the Republican because of marginally better National Labor Relations Board appointments and, a court system that won't, potentially outlaw union organizing, right? This is very basic stuff and the really obvious reasons to vote practically in my mind. But on the other hand, I'm not into, I think the idea that, I want people to have the fight, and I'm actually particularly interested in what someone like Sherrod Brown is going to do right now because, for what it's worth, he represents a major state, not just somebody who, has good politics but represents a safe blue district that really does not have the same, power